Hello and welcome to the fourth UEA Postgraduate History Research Seminar of the semester. We're a hybrid series, so we'd like to welcome both our online audience and our audience in the room, and our speakers who are joining us in person tonight as well. And we've got a landscape history sort of special for you this evening with Tom Lucking from UEA and Dr. Tom Breen, who completed his PhD at UEA and has now moved on to Oxford Brookes. So we're going to start tonight with Tom Lucking. Tom is in the second year of his Chase-funded PhD, examining settlement and land use patterns in Breckland and the extent to which climatic fluctuations may have impacted this. He studied a BA in history at UEA, graduating in 2017, before going on to work in commercial archaeology. And from 2018 to 2020, he studied a part-time MA in landscape history at UEA, whilst continuing to work in archaeology. And his PhD is full-time, but he still keeps in practice with his occasional part-time archaeological work. So, Tom, do you want to cut, and I will share your PowerPoint?
Yes, thank you, Louise. Good evening, everyone. So, as Louise just said, my name's Tom, and I'm currently in the second year of my PhD, and looking at settlement and land use patterns in the East Anglian Breckland between 1000 BC, so the late Bronze Age, and 1600 AD, so the early-ish post-medieval period, and the impact or influence, or indeed lack of, that climatic fluctuations and changes may have had on these patterns. So Breckland is formed of this area really of southwest Norfolk and northwest Suffolk. It's about 1,000 square kilometres, and it's distinguished by the fact that it's mainly formed in soils of acidic sands overlying chalk, contrasting to the surrounding areas, which consist of fenlands to the west, claylands to the south and east, and what's normally called the good sands region of Norfolk to the north, where the soils are still sandy but not quite as acidic. It has one of the lowest annual rainfalls in the UK, alongside one of the largest daily temperature ranges, and frosts have been recorded in every month of the year. The low rainfall and freely draining nature of the soil means that the landscape is relatively dry compared to the surrounding regions, and it's considered to have a more continental climate compared to the maritime climate of other parts of Britain. Historically, large parts of this landscape were covered in heathland, and the area is usually referred to as marginal, and that is much of the landscape was not considered viable for arable agriculture in the medieval periods, and arable practices revolved principally around the cultivation of barley as the main crop, which was more tolerant of the poor soils compared to wheat, alongside the keeping of large flocks of sheep, which grazed on those extensive tracts of heathland by day and were close folded on the arable at night to provide manure into the soil in order to keep the fertility levels up. And this is sort of a modern photo of Breckland, just to give you an idea of the sort of landscape we're talking about. So what we've got here is a bit of former pine plantation, which was in the process of being reverted back to heath, where the trees have just been cleared off. And in the background, you've got a more sort of traditional heathland soil there of Lake and Heath Warren, and some of these modern pine plantations in the background. And the white dots you can see are sheep. And this is the sort of thing where when you strip some of that forest soil off, you can see you've got a real sort of sandy subsoil, and some of this solid chalk is very close to the surface as well. You can see patches of solid chalk coming up. Considerable areas of land are often thought of, which were often historically heathland in character, or thought of being historically heathland in character, were enclosed as rabbit warrens in the region in the medieval and post-medieval periods. Rabbits being one of the most prolific animals in the region until the appearance of myxomatosis in the mid-20th century, which put pain to most of that. This is a map done by the Breen Society in 2010 of their survey of the rabbit warrens in Breckland, and you can see there's quite a concentration of them. And just bear in mind for the moment, these ones here are sort of Wangford, Lake and Heath, Ereswell and Mildenhall, and the ones around Elvedon and Downham, because we're going to be coming back to those later, but they're sort of warrens on the sort of western edge of the Suffolk Breckland. From the 18th century onwards, large areas of this were incorporated into formal parklands, which also saw the beginnings of some of these large-scale tree plantations in the region, something which really came to define the region after the First World War, when the considerable tracts of former heathland, parkland and warren were acquired by the Forestry Commission and turned into pine plantations. And here's just another photo showing some of those modern plantations today, these very dense stands of pine trees. And this area here was a former former pine plantation, and the Forestry Commission have done some horrendously destructive way of trying to revert it back to heathland, but that's a different story. Breckland itself is a term that was coined by W.G. Clark at the turn of the 20th century and refers to a common arable practice in the region known as brecking, where areas sort of on the periphery of the arable zone would be ploughed for a season or two and used to grow crops before having to be left for several years in order to let the soil fertility recover. Breckland has been chosen for this study really to test whether this unusual landscape may be more susceptible to climatic changes than elsewhere, or whether smaller climatic changes may have a more detectable impact in the region, or indeed if the region might be more resilient than one might assume. It's effectively asking to what extent do these changes in climate have as a long-term impact on Breckland. And I apologise if that's all rather vague, but it's attempting to summarise a lot of different things in a few paragraphs. So this presentation is just going to look at one aspect of the wider study, which is the ways which we can reconstruct the historic landscape of the region, and then take these and use these to ask as a basis to ask questions of how this region interacts with climate. This is necessary considering there's no real synthesis of Breckland history, certainly not for the last 80 or so years. So large parts of this thesis are involving actually writing that history to allow those climatic questions to be explored. So with the time, I'm just going to focus on three brief aspects of archaeology and landscape investigation. Using Bronze Age barrows as a proxy evidence for prehistoric heathland, environmental sampling of archaeological deposits, and what we can gain, insight we can gain about Roman arable practice in the region, and evidence of medieval arable extents in the region. If there's anything specific that you want me to discuss and I don't mention it, feel free to ask. And I'm not going to dwell on the technical stuff and methodologies or reference too many things too much, just for the sake of time. So if anyone has any questions, just please ask or come and see me afterwards. So prehistoric barrows in the region. What barrows themselves are essentially funerary monuments, many of which are put up in the Bronze Age, so between about 2,500 BC to about 1000 BC. And the most common type is what's known as a round barrow, which is basically a circular mound of earth under which people are buried, and with a ditch around it. And investigations of barrows on downland landscapes in southern England have shown that Bronze Age barrows were constructed on areas that were already relatively open in prehistory, often heathy in character. In the Netherlands, Quentin Bourgeois' study of Bronze Age barrows also concluded that they were constructed on heathland and they were intended to be seen in the landscape. And he took that as a proxy for the wider areas surrounding the barrows as having to have been relatively open as well, if these were monuments that were meant to be seen. And he, with his work, he suggested about a 250 metre zone around the landscape as a minimum that would have been open just to allow them to be seen to their best extent. Most of these are early and middle Bronze Age date, and they fall outside of the study period for this thesis. And the mapping of their distribution and the ploughed out versions of them as well allows us to reconstruct the minimum areas of open ground that were present in Breckland at the start of the study period, so we can get an idea of what's going on at the start. I'll just let you come. So there's some nuances with this approach as well in terms of not flattening the chronology. I mean, it's a sort of, you've got things that could have several centuries of difference, monuments that could have several centuries of difference in age between them, even though they're relatively close together in the landscape. And there's things I'm dealing with there. Just as an example on this is LiDAR imagery of part of Breckland. You've got these sort of like slight rises here, you've got one here, and there's also one down here. And when we compare them on the aerial photography, you can see you've got the sort of associated ring ditches that go with them. And those are quite typical of sort of round barrows in the region. But Bourgeois makes an interesting point with these, which he suggests that only probably about 30% of barrows that are of known recorded barrows, or rather, the recorded barrows only represent 30% of the total amount that ever probably existed. As an example, these three that I've just pointed out here, they're not recorded barrows, they're ones that I've just found looking at the LiDAR and at the aerial photography of the region. So there's sort of still plenty of work to be done with that. So this is a map of the Suffolk HER data, historic environment record data of barrows in Breckland, and just showing their distribution as well as some other barrows that I've added in. And if we sort of do that buffering, which is where we basically take those points of data and add a 250 metre circle around them in the landscape, we start to get an idea of where areas were probably, the sort of the open areas and the open character of parts of the landscape in Breckland, and we start to see which particular types of areas may have been more open in prehistory. So you can see mainly sort of in the river valleys and on these side slopes, there's quite a lot, which is also partly because they wanted barrows to be, again, visual, so they'd be put on the crests of hills and things like that where you can see them. But you can see that there's sort of blank areas on these sort of high plateaus, and again, that might be to do with where they're siting the barrows, but it might be because there are still tracts of woodland on those higher areas in prehistory. And there's also things to take into consideration, like the fact that we don't know where all of the barrows are, that this isn't a complete map of every barrow that ever existed. So you can see here at Euston, you've got all of these barrows here, then a gap, and then barrows here. And that's purely because the landscape here isn't sort of suited to survey to find these barrows. It's under plantation, it's under pasture where you can't really see many features. And the general outline we get with this is we can start to tease some of these sort of broader areas, as I say, and the general conclusion I take from this is that most Breckland itself by about 1000 BC is already relatively open. It's not heavily wooded. There might still be tracts of woodland existing in there, but when we plot the barrows and use them as a proxy for where the heathland is, where the open ground is, actually most of Suffolk Breckland at least appears to already be relatively open by this date. Moving on to the next sort of second part of this, we're looking at environmental sampling, and most archaeological investigations will take samples of soil or interesting deposits as they're going in order to retrieve preserved organic remains that would not be easily hand collected on site. Although where you've got very good preservation, as this site here, you can see that you can pick out things like this. These are spelt wheat grains from a dump of burnt Roman crop processing waste near Elvedon. And the material recovered from these samples has the potential to provide insight into the various aspects of what's happening in the landscape, including and the people that are living there, including their choice of fuel, the local ecology, and their food consumption. So we're just going to briefly look at one of these, which is the recovery of charred cereal remains as an indicator of Roman arable practices. So the traditional interpretation of medieval practices in Breckland is a regime centred on the production of barley because it's better suited to the light soils of the region. And what I've done to sort of look at the Roman stuff is sourced as many examples as possible of. Yeah, so what I've done is I sourced all of the archaeological reports I could find that basically show where, that have information relating to environmental samples containing cereal descriptions. And you can already see that there's a bit of a problem with distribution there and that most of those are from Suffolk. And I need to find out whether there actually is any more in Norfolk or whether that's sort of a genuine distribution of things. And these are taken from a range of sources, sort of archaeological reports and various things like that. But the outline that we get of this is in the late Bronze Age, actually, in the late Roman period, the evidence suggests that spelt is the dominant cereal that the Romans are trying to grow, spelt wheat. And evidence of organised surplus production comes from sites such as the A11 bypass at Elvedon, where a complex of corn dryers has been interpreted as a processing hub. And this fits with wider trends, actually, for regions explored elsewhere. So I think it's the University of Reading did a publication called The Rural Economy of Roman Britain, which basically looked at archaeological data from different regions. And they concluded as well that in the late Roman period, you're seeing organised production of spelt wheat sort of across Britain generally. And the archaeology of this part of Suffolk produces evidence for Roman activity on areas that might usually be considered heathland in later periods, but in the Roman period appear to be dotted with farmsteads within tracts of wider arable land. And one aspect of interest in Breckland is that some sites, particularly the A11, appear to produce a greater amounts of barley than you might expect. So compared to some of these other regions where you see proportions of wheat and barley, you're getting a higher than average, sort of a higher than you would expect proportion of barley in these assemblages compared to spelt wheat. And this raises questions about what the Romans are doing on this sort of acidic sandy soil in order to maximise production. And the suggestion is that there's no evidence that soil fertility is noticeably higher, but the archaeological evidence suggests that some of these parts of Breckland were being farmed to produce this surplus. And one interpretation of higher rainfall in the late Roman period was the potential to expand arable areas in Breckland. But the problem arising from higher rainfall in such free draining soils would be an increase in the washing out of nutrients from the surface. So to counteract this, it would therefore be necessary to increase the input of nutrients back into the soil. There's a number of ways that this could be achieved that are detailed in Roman texts, including the use of mull, such as the digging out of chalk and the spreading of chalk on the soil to neutralise the acidity. But the key way that this would be done would be through the use of manuring, either directly by grazing animals on the field or indirectly by carting manure out from farmyards. Because of this easily leached nature of the soil, it may therefore have been necessary to maintain larger herds of livestock in order to ensure that arable remained viable. Part of this system would then have involved taking larger numbers of cattle through the winter rather than reducing stock at this point, and to again ensure those high numbers came through in the spring to maximise manuring production. Because of these higher numbers, there would be a greater need for winter fodder, and that would encourage the growing of barley in a higher proportion than you would see elsewhere. Barley used in the Roman period is traditionally considered to be a fodder crop rather than for human consumption. This would have allowed the maintenance of these larger numbers, which in turn would have helped maintain fertility on the arable, and that would allow the overall aim of being the production of the surplus of spelt wheat to be maintained. And the reason, there's a bit of a sort of a paradox between the fact that in the medieval period they focus on barley, but in the Roman period they're able to push out these wheat surpluses. And it's mainly because, well, the reasoning I've come up with is that at the end of the Roman period, spelt wheat goes out of use. And there's settlement and population contraction into the better soils in the river valleys. And by the time settlement comes to expand again in the late Saxon period and they start to push the arable extents outwards, they're using free threshing wheat varieties rather than spelt, and free threshing wheats are not really suited to those acid sands in the same way that spelt is. I mean, spelt isn't great on it, but it's a bit more resilient, and that therefore pushes these medieval farmers towards barley as their principal crop. So now just to look at actually where some of these medieval farmers may have been farming, I just need to do a brief bit about, do a terrible couple of diagrams about how medieval fields are laid out, just so you can see, also you can understand some of the terminology I'm going to use. So this is very simplified. But in the medieval period, you have a village, and around it you have a series of large open fields that are sort of farmed in a communal way. And these fields have subdivisions in them known as furlongs, which are sort of long linear boundaries, just breaking up the field into smaller bundles of strips and things. And between these, you have these sort of ploughing strips. So if you go to the Midlands, you have these big sort of ridge and furrows that define each of these strips. In East Anglia, you have more sort of shallow, irregular type sort of ridging in the fields where they survive. And we can see these in the Breckland landscape when we look at LiDAR images. So this is Marham in Norfolk, here's the airbase, here's the village, and these long sinuous boundaries in the landscape are those furlongs that subdivide the open fields up. And if you go and come down to sort of Shoulderham and Fincham way, you can really see these big, low, sort of quite broad but low and substantial earthworks that cover large tracts, and these are the medieval fields that existed in the landscape, and you can sort of trace their extents through that. And these are not intentional earthworks. These are actually formed when a plough team reaches the end of a strip and turns around to manoeuvre to go back down and plough the next furrow. And at that point, they would clean off the tools, clean off the animals, and all of this mud would fall, clean the mud and dirt off. And over time, on these headlands, these earthwork banks form where all of this mud and stuff is just cleaned off the tools and the animals. And what that means is that where these furlongs form, that's not a brief episode of arable land use. That has to be something quite long term to form such a substantial feature. And we can see this again in other places. So here's some in Colford Hall. These are the furlongs, and this is well preserved enough in a parkland where you've actually got some of these strips surviving as well, some of the individual ridging from those individual strips. And again, this is a part of Icklingham, which is known as Icklingham Field historically, and you can see again where parts of this have been put under grass and some of these strips and furlong boundaries survive. And they're all very uniform and all very sort of consistent in terms of how they appear in the landscape. So the way to make this productive really is to look at places where we wouldn't expect to find them, such as in rabbit warrens. So this is Wangford Warren, and as we can see, we've got these long linear boundaries in here. And when we start to plot these again, you see that they form these long sinuous boundaries in the landscape, which morphologically are spot on for being furlong boundaries. And we've got stratigraphy from archaeological work in here, which suggests that these are out of use probably by 1350 when a medieval road cuts through them. So these are earlier medieval, they've gone out of use, and a rabbit warren has then been created over what was previously arable. And we can do that again in Lakenheath, where we have these long linear boundaries and we plot them. And there's other stuff going on, but you can just see again, it's a bit of what was arable land that ends up in a rabbit warren. And the same with there as well. These are much fainter, but you've got this same linear boundaries crossing the landscape, which are just large open field arable cultivation. And finally in Mildenhall, they're quite faint again, but you've got boundaries which, if we plot, just look like furlong boundaries, and they all about the same, they're all the same distance and the same sort of layout. And this is stuff from a Norfolk County Council survey where they found in Santon Downham and Elvedon warrens the similar sort of long linear banks crossing over the warrens and going through places, and they're possibly furlongs as well. And this is actually quite sort of significant when we think about Breckland, because the evidence therefore indicates that large tracts of rabbit warrens, which you would formerly think of as being taken out of unusable heathland, were actually formerly under arable cultivation for quite a long period of time before they were enclosed. Crucially, these systems appear to represent, again, established long-term landscapes in order to generate such considerable and noticeable earthworks, rather than short-lived systems or outlying bits of breck. And the presence of these systems suggests that this wasn't the case in the earlier medieval period, and that the development of heathland on these areas clearly occurs once these systems get abandoned and the rabbit warrens are established. And this raises two sort of important points really when we think about medieval land use and responses to changes in the region. The first, the contraction of arable in the Suffolk part of Breckland, at any rate, after 1350 appears to be large scale and represents a serious reduction in areas under arable. In the four parishes of Wangford, Eriswell, Lakenheath and Mildenhall, we're talking something like 2,500 acres at least going out of arable cultivation in the 14th century. And the idea that these warrens are constructed in areas that weren't really viable for much else doesn't really work if large parts of these warrens were formerly part of the open field of these parishes, unless things like potentially climatic deterioration in the 14th century meant that those areas got pushed beyond any sort of useful limit for arable and they were just abandoned, and then the manorial lords decided to establish warrens on there. So as a few brief conclusions, I'm aware this is a somewhat sort of scattergun approach for a paper, but it's really just been to show some of the ways that we can use to get to grips with a study area and a study period that are quite broad in scope and scale, and particularly for periods where there isn't necessarily any documentary evidence to talk about. And these will all end up being incorporated obviously in larger discussions on Breckland. So as a summary, the distribution of barrows in the landscape suggests that Suffolk Breckland was already relatively open in the late Bronze Age, although it's likely that there was still some woodland existing. Assessment of the environmental evidence suggests that the Roman approach to cereal growing in this landscape was to adapt their systems to the local environment in a way that allowed them to still produce a useful surplus of spelt wheat in a similar way to that seen elsewhere in England. And in a contrast to the medieval way adaptation to the region, which involved changing the crops they would normally try to grow and adapting that way rather than changing everything else about what they were doing. The extent of this medieval arable prior to the 14th century in Suffolk, at least, was greater than has previously been assumed, as shown by these extensive networks of furlongs in rabbit warrens. Likewise, these warrens were not totally barren heathland before they were founded as warrens, but judging from the size of some of these furlong banks, had been under long-term arable cultivation in some areas of what became warren, and it appears that the wider problems of the 14th century played a role in the contraction of this arable. How much of this is the result of climate is yet unclear, but this is obviously my next priority for my thesis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. You've really illustrated to what extent layers of landscape build up, I think, especially on the LiDAR. It's so clear, and you can see exactly what you mean in which the landscape changes over time. We're now going to go straight on, as I say, to Tom Breen's paper. We do the papers back to back, and there'll be a chance for you to ask questions at the end. Online group, you'll be able to type them into the chat box. So we'll go straight to Tom Breen's paper on finding footpaths. Tom Breen is a landscape historian working at Oxford Brookes on the AHRC funded project In All Our Footsteps, tracking, mapping and experiencing rights of way in post-war Britain. So I will share Tom's PowerPoint with us. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. It's always a pleasure to visit UEA, especially after so long. I'm going to be speaking today about rights of way, and we're going to be looking at, in particular, 3 sources which offer the most comprehensive, detailed and widespread view of the landscape in England before the First World War. These cartographic and documentary sources have been used by historians since their creation to analyse the economy, politics and society of contemporaries. But I'm going to be specifically looking at how they can be used to analyse rights of way. Finally, we'll be applying this knowledge to modern day legal disputes to uncover how these sources can help determine the public or private status of rights of way. So it might go without saying, but all maps are obviously created for a specific purpose. Few large-scale maps exist before the Ordnance Survey. Why? Because they were so expensive. So it stands to reason that they were only created for economic reasons. So that's really something to bear in mind throughout this. Here we have an example of the pre-enclosure landscape, which the other Tom was discussing so eloquently. These are the sort of open field strips with the mouse here. And you've got a clear sort of right of way through them, as well as these public roads that go in the characteristic crossroads here. And this is the first source we'll be looking at, enclosure. Now, enclosure is both a physical and a legal term. Physically, it's the literal fencing, hedging or walling in of land by a single person. And legally, it extinguished common rights and abolished open fields and reallocated holdings in compact blocks. So essentially you go from a landscape like this to a landscape like this. So this is the exact same region, but you've got enclosure laying out these clear allotments and putting in a private road to access all of them. So this was increasingly sanctioned by Parliament through the 17th and 19th centuries. So that's, yeah, Parliamentary Enclosure. The second source we'll be looking at is the Tithe. The Tithe was a tax paid to support the church and clergy. It was historically paid in kind and based on a tenth of produce. So your field of barley or whatever crop you were growing, you would literally take a tenth of that, put it to one side and wait for the clergyman to collect it. So obviously quite an antiquated system. The church resisted any change until about 1836, when finally it was reformed, which ironically helped stabilise the church's position for the next century or so. So that's the Tithe, the second source. And the third source we'll be looking at today is the Finance Act. The Finance Act was created by Lloyd George in 1910 as part of an effort to create an increment value duty. This is a new tax which could be levied upon the sale or inheritance of property based on the increase in its value, which could be attributed, in Lloyd George's words, to the enterprise of the community or of the landowner's neighbours. So essentially this means when a railway goes in, as the suburbs are expanding, your land increases in value, you know, maybe 3, 4, 5 times fold through no effort of your own. That's investment of the state in infrastructure. So the idea is to levy a tax on that and recoup some of that value. So not a terrible idea by any means. So what I've really been doing is I've been to the archives collecting the source data for almost 100 parishes across 3 counties. So that's Hertfordshire, Norfolk and Northamptonshire. And I've then analysed how each of the maps display rights of way and crucially how each document describes the right of way. So for Parliamentary Enclosure, as I said, 16th to the 19th centuries, we'll take a closer look at this first, as it offers some of the strongest evidence in rights of way cases because they were actually creating, diverting or extinguishing rights through an act sanctioned by Parliament. So this process created both a map and an award. I'm principally concerned with the parts that describe roads, bridleways, footpaths, that sort of thing. So this is a good illustration of a parliamentary enclosure map where you've got all of those really. You've got a public bridleway up here, a footpath, a private road, and these are the principal public roads in the parish of Stoke Bruin and Shuttlanger in Northamptonshire. Very nice and easily labelled, which is always handy. And this is part of the accompanying ward as well, which would list out the private roads in this case. So you've got a helpful description here, as well as they'll often include the width of each route. And in the case of private roads, often the usage and maintenance for each of them. So here's another map where they've helpfully labelled the width of the road on the map as well. Sometimes they're less helpful. So you've got cases such as this, where the scribe and the cartographer have clearly had a bit of a disagreement, and they've just sort of gone over what the scribe's written. So it's not always completely straightforward. This is a good case in Little Hormead in Hertfordshire, where this is this is actually a tithe map from before the enclosure date, and then you've got the enclosure. So you can see that before the route, the public road in this case, loops around to the north, and then they're replacing this, diverting it with a nice straight road, which certainly would make everyone's lives easier, and the allotments that the parliamentary commissioners are allotting a lot easier to work with. So a key thing to remember in the enclosure, parliamentary enclosure, is that this is a public process. The parishioners, or indeed anyone with an interest in the land, would meet in the local pub, and it was invariably the local pub, to discuss the enclosure. All were given a chance to object to the proposed roads. So here we've got listing the roads, and yet no one objects at the time. This one's quite interesting because you've got Mr. Thomas objecting to the full length of the route because he's brought up a lot of the allotments. So this is a sort of clear case you've got where previously the route was going to come all the way across east from this road to this allotment, and just ever so slightly is shortened and doesn't go across that final allotment. Now this obviously might seem quite minuscule, but this is precisely the historical evidence that's used in courts today, because you might have a modern estate here or some properties that you'll want to work out precisely where the routes lead. So this is a very public process. The roads are actually laid out in the landscape for 21 days to give everyone a chance to see the proposed changes. So the idea that routes were sort of laid out and the public weren't aware of them is sort of not really quite true. The second source, the Tithe, 1836. The Tithe records are really interesting as they do not directly deal with rights of way. So the commissioners creating these maps were instead concerned with the tithable produce of the land in question, because as I said earlier, they're trying to convert the payments in kind, a tenth of all produce, to cash compositions, which obviously make things a lot easier. This is an example of a tithe map. So the Tithe commissioners were directed to give all parcels of land an apportionment number, and then they would refer to these numbers in the accompanying apportionment, where they'd list the landowners, occupiers, state of cultivation of the land, sometimes also its name and the measurements and such. Obviously, for rights of way, there's a slight problem here in that there's no direct consideration of labelling or numbering routes specifically. So each commissioner invariably handles this differently. So roads which are numbered and then listed in this apportionment with a landowner and an occupier can be presumed to be privately owned by that specific individual. And in these cases, they're often named drove or drift or driftway, that sort of thing, particularly in Norfolk. So here's the accompanying map of this. So you've got 90 and 172 clearly being routes which are cul-de-sacs and lead to farmland. So this is quite important because it sort of can sometimes these names in the Tithe apportionment can sometimes provide a bit of a window into the usage of these routes and therefore their legal status. So that seems pretty straightforward. Roads on the Tithe, if they're numbered, they're private. Those that are left without numbers must be public. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Sometimes a commissioner would label all routes in a parish for the Tithe with numbers, and then at the end of the apportionment, so this sort of document here, they would list public roads, and those paying attention might have already spotted this one at the bottom, which is a private road within the public roads, which seems quite strange. So part of the challenge with these sources is reconciling the sometimes contradictory definitions. This makes sense if you sort of get a leap of logic, and this is clearly a private road owned by several individuals, but because it's not owned by a single individual, it's not therefore listed in the apportionment, so it ends up here. But obviously each Tithe commissioner will decide to do something different. So I think that's a key point really, that you've got to not create any hard and fast rules with these sources and look quite carefully at what they're actually saying. So another thing about the tithe, which is continually mentioned in court cases, is the colour. So sienna is often said to refer to public roads, and whereas private roads would be left uncoloured. The evidence that I found doesn't wholly support this, although it's true in most cases. You've got a case here where the church isn't really accessible by a supposedly public road. So I think there's more going on here than you would think. Remember that the tithe was fundamentally about valuing tithable produce of the land. So if any parcel of land did not produce tithable income, it could be excluded. So colouring seems probably more an indication of surfacing rather than the status of the root. So if particularly wide roots could produce crops that are often in the 19th century, small plots are taken over for potato fields, potato plots for the poor. So you can therefore produce some produce on them. So then, you know, that's a sort of strange category that it's not entirely clear how you would list them in the tithe. And then here's another case of a tithe map where, yeah, it doesn't use colour, but this is quite a prominent public road. So again, that's just making the point that you can't create these hard and fast rules where you can decide one way or another what colour public or private road would be on this specific map. And sometimes, although it's quite rare, the tithe map makers will decide to include footpaths and bridleways and mark them on their map, although they're not required to do so, and it's really outside the boundary of the remit of the Tithe Commission. So that's the tithe. Very briefly, we've got the Finance Act from 1910. So the basis for the Finance Act being used in rights of way disputes is simple. Those parcels which were excluded from land holdings are presumed to be in public ownership. So this is a rather fetching tithe map, where it's essentially the OS base map from the second edition from the 1908 and 1910 usually. Sometimes there'll be a special edition that they'll make if you've got areas such as Hertfordshire where you've got quite a lot of suburbanisation, so it gets quickly outdated, so they'll make another one. And then each plot of land is then coloured and numbered according to ownership. And the basis for this being used is that the parcels which are excluded are presumed to be in a public ownership. They're owned by the district council and presumably public roads. So here's another case of them sometimes as well giving the road name on the map and leaving those main routes white because no single individual owns them. Here we've got a case, this was actually the map we saw earlier, where you've got the private road here, so Small Gaines Lane, which is left white on the Finance Act map because no single individual owns it. But it is not always that straightforward. So in this case, this is the Parliamentary Enclosure map, which I've rather crudely coloured in the allotments which are laid out for this road. So this all these 12 allotments are specifically said to use this private road and maintain it. And so by the time of the Finance Act in 1910, not much has changed here. You've still got the route and it's still providing access to these properties, although they have been consolidated somewhat. But then, you know, the Finance Act valuers are left having to leave it white because it obviously isn't individually owned. So it's, again, not quite clear cut that all white roads are public on the Finance Act, and so you've got again this sort of shared ownership and shared usage creating problems. Another one which I'm quite proud of finding, this one where these are separate maps. I've just sort of crudely put them together, but you've got an individual route which is white to the north and coloured to the south. So again, quite a clear sign that although lawyers are trying to use these sources to prove legal status, at the time, whether this would be thought about by the valuers or not is a separate question. Presumably, they're just trying to get the job done and end up with situations like this where there's a clear sign that you're not having the valuers think perhaps about how these maps are going to be interpreted in the future. So that's a brief run through of the three principal sources which are used in legal disputes because they offer the best evidence, although as I've said they're not perfect. So what lessons have we learned from this analysis? I created an indexing tool which shows how each road is depicted on each map, and this I use to analyse the characteristics of different types of roads and try and establish broad patterns. So here's just a smorgasbord of charts for you. Basically, this is showing that earlier parliamentary enclosure wards are laying out larger numbers of public roads, and as we go forwards through the 19th century they're laying out fewer and fewer, and the same applies for the width of public roads, the length of public roads, and the connections of public roads. So that's the number of roads that they are joined to or provide connection points to. So if we compare public roads and private roads as well, sort of establish 500 metres as roughly the marker. Shorter ways tend to be private and longer ways tend to be public. Public roads are invariably a larger width, which makes sense, and have more connections to other routes. Interestingly, 99% of ways which were public on Parliamentary Enclosure are white on the Finance Act. So again, going back to the Finance Act, although I've just argued against that, those that were specifically public at Parliamentary Enclosure, it does appear that they tend to stay public. So and another thing likewise is that private roads, which are cul-de-sacs, tend to stay private, whereas private roads which are particularly long, wide or well connected tend to become public, either on the definitive map today or on these Tithe and Finance Act. The key way, I should say, that these sources, historic sources, are used in modern legal cases is this legal maxim: once a highway, always a highway. And this is the basis for which these historic sources are used. So if it can be proved on a balance of probabilities, and that balance of probabilities is the sort of legal scales of justice, so you only need to prove up to 51% to get it through, that a public right of way existed at some point in the past, then it should be legally established today, unless of course it has been legally stopped up by subsequent action. So if in the absence of any statutory action, a public way that you can find on these sources will be re-established today. So these sources need to be balanced to ascertain the true status of public rights of way. 2026 is the key date because this is the deadline laid out by the Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000, which marks 2026. They gave everyone 25 years to get this definitive map, which is the map of public rights of way, up to scratch and to make it finally, hopefully, definitive, so that historic rights of way can no longer be added after 2026, because this was essentially an aim to provide some certainty to landowners and the public alike, in which you would give everyone 25 years and thus you can't buy a parcel of land and then have someone like myself find a historic map and try and claim public rights. So this has sort of given everyone a key deadline. There's attempts by the Ramblers, quite a big one, and you'll probably hear it more and more in the coming years. They've searched with 3,000 volunteers and found almost 50,000 miles of lost paths, which aren't on the definitive map, but which were on an earlier map, or which the local community believe to be public and are walking as rights of way, but that they're not technically on the map. Yeah, it's sort of key to add these on before the end date. Of course, we're already getting attempts to extend this deadline, and there's provision for which in the legislation. Whether or not it will happen, speaking to the Ramblers recently, their feeling is that we might end up getting another couple of years, taking you up to 2028 possibly, in which the government could blame COVID and give everyone a bit more leeway. One thing I haven't mentioned, but which I'll finish with today, is the power of the elite. These are the modern day elite, celebrities who attempt, sometimes successfully, to close rights of way. Apologies for the old BBC articles for Jeremy Clarkson and Madonna. But these are quite publicised cases at the time, and the more recent one of Gina De Campo, basically attempting to remove rights of way which are public, and yeah, sort of a key example of this continuing happening today. So thanks very much for listening. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but yeah, very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting. Obviously, such a topical issue as well. That's so relevant to what's going on at the moment in the landscape. We can now take questions for both of our papers. So I'm going to ask both Toms to come up and join me in front of the camera, because you'd rather see them than me, and I will stand off to one side. Online group, I'm going to ask you to type in the chat box, and I can therefore read out your questions to our speakers. You probably noticed tonight both of our speakers are called Tom. So if you could direct your questions at Tom Breen to do with Tom Breen to do with Footpaths, and Tom Lucking to do with Breckland. Is going to happen a lot, I'm sure. That would be fantastic. But yes, questions in the room. If you speak loudly, we should be able to pick them up. If you want to remove your mask to do so, that's fine. So, any questions for our speakers?
So, can you hear me? Sorry for the mask and everything. Yeah, so you've talked about the legal ramifications of the right of way. Sorry, this is a question for Tom Breen.
Worked out quickly, thankfully, yeah.
And you've also talked about the ambiguities that might be raised by the scribes kind of recording some of the things, so like the colours of the roads, the way that they record it as a private public. How much of an issue is that proved in the modern day in terms of actually determining whether a path is a right? We do have the right of way for the public. And if the ambiguities are too much to really discern one way or the other, what way do the courts or the state kind of fall on in determining whether a path should become a right of way that's been lost in the past? Sorry for the long question.
No, absolutely, brilliant. Well, I mean, obviously the answer is annoyingly it depends, but it's a balance. It's a balancing act of all these sources. So I've run through the Enclosure, Tithe and Finance Act. Sometimes often those sources won't agree. So you'll get the Finance Act, for instance, showing a white road, or half a white road and half a coloured road, which often is the case. And then you'll get the enclosures saying something different, or being a little bit ambiguous in whether it's a private carriage road with rights for the entire parish or just a specific few individuals. So there's all sorts of ambiguity there, and really it's just a case of getting as much evidence as possible. So those three are the principal sources, but there's obviously lots of other records, sometimes archaeological evidence. The other main source is user evidence. So you'll have older members of the community that have been resident in a parish for many years recall their memories of, yeah, we always walked this way and never got stopped or turned back, or particular farmers or landowners saying no, we always turned anyone back that we saw. So yeah, it's a balancing act, and which I guess makes it all the more interesting. hopefully I've covered most of your points there.
Yeah,
Apologies if
that
not.
was good content in there.
Yeah, thanks both. This is for Tom Breen. Obviously, you suggested that you want to approach this. This is your project, to approach it from the climate angle. And I'm just wondering what you think this might also tell us about some of our ideas about complexity and economic and agricultural specialization. Thinking of some of the common nostrums, or kind of some of the things that one inherits of thinking about the Roman period, one thinks about forms of specialization, right? That areas that are good for certain things to be used. One thinks of pottery, one certainly thinks about that, rather than local production, cottage industry, rather than thinking about a more integrated and complex economic system. What do you think this says about that? The use of spelt and what you're otherwise, with all of the extra things that need to be done to do that. Does that speak to an ability to do that, or does that make us kind of maybe reconsider some of these things about specialization and what is marginal and what is, and so on?
I think the question of margin, I guess the thing about marginality is, I guess it's relative to what you're trying to do with somewhere. When people talk about Breckland being marginal, it's always to do with agriculture, and it's usually sort of termed as it's usually one of those sort of 18th, 19th century improver sort of things of the land isn't good, so we need to improve it because it's marginal sort of outlook. With the Roman angle, I mean, the short answer is yes, it's special. They're able to specialise, I think probably because they have that sort of slightly imperial structure and the ability to do it. Also because they love slave labour, things are cheap, so labour is cheap. So if you're keeping a lot of cattle, you usually stall feed them and generate middens and muck heaps on the farm, cart that out to the fields. Well, that requires a lot of labour to do that. But if you've got slaves, you can do that. So it's a more economic effort to generate, sort of to keep arable, say, on these less fertile soils, to keep it viable, because you've got the ability to source that labour. I think it's also a general thing with the spelt is that probably by this stage it's main, or the opinions seem to be it's mainly to sort of supply armies. So it's supplying people on Hadrian's Wall. It's being sent off to the Rhine for the armies on the Rhine. And I guess it's more of a response to a wider economic demand within the empire that they need to do that. That obviously there's things locally that they're supplying, and obviously everyone's growing stuff locally. It's not that they're not growing anything else at all. It's that that's obviously what demand is for wheat. Whether they are intentionally growing spelt or whether that's just the wheat that they're using, so to speak, I'm not quite sure. But that's what's demanded. That's what the market is demanding. So that's what they're producing surpluses of, processing on sites like Elverden, and then presumably sending off out via the fens off to the frontier or off to the Rhineland.
Thank you.
We've got a question from Vivian online for Tom Breen. Given that local authorities are under financial pressures, how likely is it that the definitive maps will be updated in time for the 2026 deadline, even if the willing list is there, but there isn't the staff to do it?
Great question. Could have written it myself. Yeah, I mean, essentially, there's huge pressures, and some. I was speaking to a local authority, county council last week, who shall remain nameless, who have a backlog of 390 cases, and considering these individual cases, one definitive map officer might be getting through 6-7 cases a year. We're looking at decades, sort of 50, 60, 70, 80 years in some local authorities. That's not the case for everyone, and part of this Footsteps project, which I'm doing at the moment, is looking at why there are these discrepancies between particular local authorities. So why some are able to get through a lot quicker than others. So basically, we're not going to be saving every public right of way out of these almost 50,000 miles that the Ramblers have identified. That they're going to be fortunate to save 5% of those. So it's a case at the moment of prioritising, looking, okay, which which rights do we want to proceed with and want to save, and which ways aren't going to actually be useful. Obviously, you get the idea in your head that as soon as 2026 comes by, you're going to have all these locals who have been walking on routes and cycling on routes and riding horses on routes and whatnot, particularly normally, and then suddenly the landowner will close. I think that's probably a fanciful scenario. Routes which are heavily used by the public tend to actually be on the definitive map already, so hopefully you won't get too many of those, and there'll be more edge cases. But yeah, essentially there needs to be more awareness of this issue and really sort of lobbying by public and ministers to make sure that we can get as many added before the deadline.
Some staggering statistics in that as well, definitely. Your question, we're from here first.
Thanks for both papers, Tom Breen. On the back of that, what you were saying about, so it has to go through the local councils have to deal with it, essentially.
Yeah, whoever is the highway authority. So sometimes in London that'll be, you know, the districts, but invariably it's county councils. Yeah,
which are underfunded anyway.
Of course. So,
I mean, I don't know, I just get this impression that, you know, I don't know, let's say that the government now, the same government then, but they're just going, right, that's it. And you go, well, you know, you didn't get through them. I mean, if they do that, and just, as you said, it's about prioritising. But then there's this big push, you know, let's get as many routes through as possible. Isn't that going to kind of make a conflict? Because you're going to have people who are just trying to find every route in the last, well, either 400 years.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you prioritise other than just saying lots of people use this one? Is that?
Well, I mean, it's an open question, really, and it is difficult because there's no clear economic formula of how valuable a right-of-way is, or how you can sort of get some usage figures, but how do you put a value on, you know, the coastal path or long-distance paths? How do you put a value on the local route that you often see dog walkers use? You know, it's got this sort of economic and social value, which is just sort of beyond reach. And another sort of broader question throughout my thesis is really, is this perhaps the correct approach? You know, trying to create this definitive map, which is final, and then, okay, we can draw a line under this and that's sorted. You have this discrepancy between the legal record, definitive map, which you're trying to get to, which is perhaps unattainable, and the physical reality, and the blurriness between those two is quite broad.
Yeah, I mean, particularly with, I don't know, especially in Norfolk, but many areas of the country, with new kind of this push to the suburbs, spurred by COVID. I mean, it's surely just going to throw up more conflicts with people at the moment trying to prove rights away, and then that getting siphoned off the, you know, housing estates. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think this has proven that the system doesn't work. And this was a 1949 initiative, National Parks and Countryside and Rights of Way Act, set out the definitive map. And, you know, we're on 75 or however long it is since then, and we still haven't reached this definitive map. So I think we need to be looking at local access forums, sort of community-led sort of local communities, and work out, okay, how do we create the best system which works for landowners as well as the general public.
Nice.
Seems to be a kind of national answer to a very local problem, doesn't it? Which doesn't seem to necessarily.
It never works.
I saw Danny next.
Yes. Again, fantastic for both Toms, but I was particularly fascinated with Tom Lucking's research and how it's looking at these changes. What's going on when you're saying that the late Roman period you had the development of spelt? What's going on in the early Roman period? And is the change just about this cooling and wetting of the atmosphere, or is it about the changing demands of Britannia?
So, as sort of an outline of what's going on, so in the in prehistory, they're sort of growing mixtures of various spelt emmer and various things like that in far prehistory. In the Iron Age, they sort of get into growing, from what I've seen in Breckland, they're growing spelt as that principal crop. But again, when I say principal crop, I can talk about proportions where it might be like 52% compared to 48 barley, that sort of thing. And that does seem to be intensifying in the late Iron Age. There's evidence for arable expansion, and that's where you're hitting a period of what some people describe as quite exceptional stability in the 1st and 2nd centuries afterwards. So it's almost like that allows a certain degree of arable expansion. This is a more wide thing, as more general comment about it written more widely. You have a certain degree of arable expansion then, but some people, I think Peter Murphy suggested that when you have this wetter 3rd and 4th century, it means that in Breckland, where it's previously been too dry, suddenly you can, somewhere's, it might have been a bit arid before, suddenly it comes into that threshold of being, okay, we can do something with it. And I think they probably are producing surpluses, in the early Roman period, but it's that mark sort of, I think, from the evidence, mainly because late Roman stuff is quite prominent to an extent, but also because I think it's where you have this sort of military need as as you have all of those problems of empire building up in the 3rd and 4th centuries, suddenly you need soldiers actively on various frontiers who all need food to eat. And there does seem to be a certain sort of like, I don't want to sort of like talk about great big top-down organisation, but obviously the imperial mechanisms in Britain at the time are able to push. Yes, and they're able to sort of like meet that demand and push things towards this surplus production. I mean, surplus, again, it's something that's seen more widely by other studies, that you're having this, that they're pushing for that, and they're pushing out this surplus of spelt.
We'll go to Ed next, because I saw Ed.
Yeah, sorry, I just kind of follow up a little bit on this definitive bank at the top. And so is there any kind of contingency built in for the landscape changing, and sort of as maybe a more extreme example, as the coastal path is eroded, does that just, do you lose that right of way, or is there anything built into?
Yeah, you've hit on a case which lined the pockets of many lawyers in a particular case which I forget the name of, but yeah, there's nothing perhaps built in. The interesting point about erosion is the coastal path, where the England coast path, which is hopefully finally going to be finished somewhat soon in the next year. Perhaps it's been delayed because of COVID and all sorts of other funding issues, but they have built in a fallback. They've got a sort of threshold, which is quite novel in rights of way, because usually they're technically a sort of linear, individual, single line. So you've got coastal paths which have a what's the word, up to the sort of high water threshold and whatnot. More broadly, there's all sorts of schemes for landowners, DEFRA, that do margins of land which you can lay over for biodiversity and get some money from the government that way. So there's sorts of there's other things that can help the government think less in terms of black and white and more, okay, we're going to give slightly and create a larger boundary, and then maybe think separately. It's more the problem that access isn't in a lot of these new schemes and new legislation. So you're getting schemes for biodiversity and things like that, but you're not getting as much public access, which needs to be sort of more central, I think.
We've got a question for Tom Locking from Louise online. She says, your interesting example of the rabbit warrens being created from previous arable strips. How much of this was repurposing that could be linked with a lack of person power for cultivation due to the Black Death, as well as possible environmental reasons?
That's sort of hit on the crux of most climate-based sort of landscape studies, which is, if you're looking at climate as your main thing, the challenge is always trying to find some sort of solid causal link compared to just correlation. I think the answer is yes, it probably is a bit of that, or in large part, just the fact there's not enough people to plough the land. sort of arable contraction isn't again something that's necessarily limited to Breckland, and it does fit wider trends in that way. There is some documentary evidence of there's places, I think West Stowe, they found excavations there, they found arable contraction. Parts of Brandon Warren used to be there's records talking about how they used to be under open field but were since incorporated into the Warren. And I suppose it probably is a degree of that as well. It's after 1350, you may not have the people, you may just not have the people to make it worth ploughing that area. And if it's already somewhere that, perhaps is towards the periphery of the village and perhaps maybe by definition towards the edge of the arable belt, there just comes a point perhaps where they just say, this isn't worth it, we're going to step back, where we've actually got enough people to keep the ploughs going and leave and abandon that bit there. And at some point after that, the manorial lords probably go, well, we can't do much else with it, we'll just whack a warren on it. But I can imagine you probably, it's probably a bit of everything. There probably is certainly a climatic element to the fact that the climate in the 14th century is just generally rubbish. And then if half your village dies, maybe you just think that bit's always been a bit difficult, we just won't bother with it.
Tom, looking on the ownership of the Breckland in the medieval period, is any of it royal forest? Is any under which honours or owners do they fall under? And are there any specific manors in which you can then chase off any positions to find actual monetary values for that?
There's no forest. It's all generally held as sort of manors and in private ownership. There's a lot of it obviously near Bury St Edmunds, so a lot of it at Domesday falls under the ownership of the Abbey at Bury. Obviously Suffolk and Norfolk Domesdays are very detailed, so there's a lot we can look at there, what's happening in 1066. People that have looked at this, I mean, Mark Bailey wrote extensively on sort of medieval Breckland agriculture, and I'm sure he looked at a lot of various medieval documents looking at land values and crop outputs and things like that, which I sort of didn't go into this evening just because it's just for time sort of constraints. But the short answer is yes, you could almost see perhaps whether you have land value changes and whether perhaps different manors under different forms of ownership might be doing stuff slightly differently. One interesting thing is when you look at, say, this arable extent where you see these former arable fields in rabbit warrens in Suffolk, I found no evidence of that on the Norfolk side of Breckland at all. So all of the warrens that are listed in Breckland, I've looked at all of the LiDAR and all of the bits, I can't see any sign that, say, Beechamwell Warren or some of the Norfolk warrens are actually arable before. They just seem to be coming straight out of heathland.
Any more questions in the room or online group? Have we got any more questions for you to type? I've got one for Tom Breen then. We had the newspaper articles, which are obviously really like high profile cases of people trying to shut a footpath. And that thing you said about once a highway, always a highway. I mean, how easy is it actually to close a footpath if you wanted to?
The elite landowners back in the 18th century and before would tend to do it on their estates. So I'm sure you're aware of Blickling, a case where they didn't quite manage because there's a road going straight across the front of it, which only when you're there you realise is a little strange, because you put it together that hang on, yeah, all the other estates you visit often won't have any roads anywhere near them. So for roads, you can do it. There is mechanism, particularly the Parliamentary Enclosure. Before then, it's quite a more difficult process of jumping through chancery courts and that sort of thing, and it's quite expensive. But if you're the big landowner of the day, you can do it. So yeah, there is a case on roads. With rights of way, there's this other question which often drifts around colloquially, that larger landowners in the parish would sit on the parish council. The parish councils are the bodies that are initially supposed to go and create the definitive map in the 50s and 60s, and you get a distinctive lack of rights of way across their estates. The Hobhouse, Arthur Hobhouse, who was the individual who actually wrote the initial report in 47, which led to the 1949 Act. I've heard sort of third hand that, yeah, if you actually look at the land he owned, there was a distinctive lack of any rights of way going through it. So yeah, you get these sorts of things, you get all sorts of stories that as late as the 70s and 80s, they're calling meetings and the agent of the large landowner will call the meeting open, say, yeah, we found no rights of way across any of this land. Okay, meeting closed. So these things do happen quite late, and I guess sort of this celebrity ones are sort of the modern version of that. So
yeah, thank you.
I mean, just on that same topic, I mean, it's so interesting thinking about, you know, trying to set in stone something that happened a long time ago, but also over, you know, even within this period, thinking, and I mean, I'm thinking about what rights of way are for, you know, and what rights of way were for then, and what rights of way were for in the 40s and 50s, and what they're for now. You know, who uses them? What type of people use them, and for what purposes? Coastal paths are interesting because those are for recreation, but also almost all of these rights of way, in many ways, have a, you know, many of them have either presumably have a recreational purpose or I don't know, an antiquarian purpose, to have them because we once had them. So how is the issue of use and the social position of users of rights of way, you know, I mean, presumably that's part of the issue, and that's also kind of a historical change that's been happening. But also, you know, how does that play into these issues in your view?
yeah, absolutely, and that you've really sort of got to the crux of the problem, that we've gone from this invariably agricultural use, particularly with these historical documents, to this recreational use, and you've got this notion of the usually white middle class man as the lonely rambler going up the fells and doing these long distance paths, and thus, you know, every other sort of group is excluded from that narrative. So if we can go back to the 49 Act and sort of, yeah, try and, that's part of the project we're working on at the moment, is to work out, okay, what are they actually thinking, and what are they envisaging the network to look like in 1949, because it's very different from now, and it's certainly very different from the historical evidence from the past. So again, going back to this sort of question of value, which we discussed earlier, it's a case of sort of, can we try and work out how much value recreational rights have, and if they're coming from agricultural use, or you know, what was the historic purpose of the route? A route that led to the church might well have been public in all but name to the local parishioners and the churchgoers, but technically today, if it wasn't for the wider public, then it wouldn't technically be public. So it's, yeah, this question of, well, what do we want the network to look like? Who do we want to have access, and improving access for a broader range of people, not just the, you know, nice routes in the countryside that are essentially part of the value of the middle class properties around them, that, you know, you have other areas which are critically sort of underserved by rights of way, because they're expensive to sort of maintain and produce. They're not sort of a free sort of thing that often I think a lot of people think they are. They cost money to maintain, and they cost money to keep free from sort of the creep of development, particularly in urban areas. So, yeah.
Any more questions? Do we have the online as well? Thank you. Okay, well, I'll have another round of applause for our speakers. And I will share the last slide that I've got with us this evening. So before I announce the seminar next week, I want to share with you the call for papers, which has gone live today. Hopefully people at UEA, you received the email with it on, and people external watching this, you will hopefully get to see it via Twitter as well. If you've enjoyed the series this year, and thank you ever so much for all these regular faces who always come along, and you'd like to contribute, we're going to be running the seminar series again through February and March. And the call for papers is out until the 7th of January. So yeah, please get in touch with me. As I say, most of you will have access to this anyway, and I look forward to hearing from you. Beyond that, there we go. Sorry. Beyond that, our seminar series next week, we're welcoming 2 external speakers who will be speaking online to us via Microsoft Teams. But as always, you're more than welcome to come and join us in person in the room so we can watch and field questions that way. We've got Natalie Grace from the University of Nottingham, who is studying sorcery and storms in early modern German and English print, 1560 to 1690. And Hannah Slack, who is a former UEA alumni, who's now gone off to University of Sheffield, who studies amongst the monstrous beasts, hunting and shipboard society in the early Atlantic. So hopefully those take your fancy, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you ever so much.